Hello, everybody. I am Peng Zhao from the University of Tennessee, and today is my great honor and pleasure to introduce you our speaker, Professor Venkat Raman from the University of Michigan. And Dr. Venkat Raman received his PhD from Iowa State in the Department of Chemical Engineering and was a NASA Center for Turbulence Research Postdoctoral Fellow at Stanford. Prior to joining University of Michigan, he was on the faculty of the University of Texas at Austin. He now serves as tenured full professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Aerospace Engineering. And Professor Raman received NSF CAREER Award in 2008 and a Distinguished Paper Award at the International Combustion Symposium in 2013. And he held multiple faculty recognitions at UT Austin and UMich. He was elected Fellow of the Combustion Institute in 2022 and serves as Associate Editor of Combustion Flame, as well as AIAA Journal Propulsion and Power. So far, Professor Raman has advised and currently advising 40 PhD and master students, and has published more than 175 peer-reviewed articles in archival journals and conferences. Professor Raman's research interests lie in a broad area of computational propulsion, with recent focus on detonation engines and scramjet-based hypersonic propulsion. And let's thank our speaker and Professor Raman. The time is yours.
Thank you, Peng. Thanks for the introduction. I have to say, I look through many of these webinars because it always shows up when I search for something, and it's always interesting to see what people are talking. So it's a great effort to get people to come in and present. So I'm very excited to talk about this, detonation engines. I've been working in this for now 8 years now. So we got started in 2016 when the Department of Energy wanted to look at detonation engines for application in gas turbines. And so we started looking at what it means to simulate these engines, what are the core physics. And over the years, we've learned a number of things, some good, some bad, but this is what we have learned. So I'll go through them. This talk is in two parts. The first one focuses mainly on the gas part, the gas-based or gaseous detonation engines, and the second part on the challenges with liquids. Now, the gas phase, we understand a lot more clearly because it's simpler compared to the liquid phase. So the tone is different for each one of them. And on the right-hand side, you see these pictures on this, which shows some of the calculations that we have done. These I would call them as engineering calculations. They're not like typical detonation calculations that are very highly resolved and require lots of grid points and so on. But this captures the essential features of practical engines. So why detonation engines? So before I do that, I want to have this, that I put it here, so I missed talking about this. So the students who did this work, there were about 7 of my PhD students who worked on detonation engines so far. And Ral and Sebastian contributed a lot to what I'm going to talk about here. Michael and Caleb, on the other hand, did more of the practical RE calculations. But in the past, there were other students, including Supraj and Takuma, who really got started on how we do these calculations. And we also have a number of collaborators, both experimentalists, or mostly experimentalists, and some simulation people who are not listed here. Okay, so why detonation engines? It's very exciting for a very simple reason. If you look at typical propulsion applications for combustion, every application has its own thermodynamic cycle and the whole own kind of system. So if it's stationary gas turbines, it's typically premixed gas turbines. If it's aircraft engines, it's more diffusion flame or diffusion systems. And if it's internal combustion engines, more volumetric combustion is different. So because you have different propulsion applications with different systems, there's no unifying concept. So we essentially divide the field into many parts, and each group works on particular applications. Detonation engines, on the other hand, are unifying. The same system can be used, or the same kind of physics can be used from anywhere from gas turbines to rocket engines to scramjets. And this is the main advantage of these kinds of systems. There are also more practical considerations. Typically, when you think of combustor, they're volumetric. There's some can or some kind of cylindrical combustor in which things happen. But in a detonation engine, you don't need to have a cylinder. These are surface-based or surface-level chemical reactions. So you can have arbitrary shapes. So for instance, the top left is a typical configuration, 2 cylinders, and there's a flow in between, and detonations are sustained there. This is what we'll talk about the rest of this seminar, so I won't go too much into it. But if I can just squish it, I can make it into a racetrack system on the top right. So that's an elliptical cross-section looking at it from the top. Or the bottom right, which is called a chuckling detonation, where you have a linear combustor and the detonation just goes side to side. Okay, so which is very different from how we think about gas turbines. And of course, all of this can be integrated into any flow path, whatever Mach numbers. So this, for instance, is an example of integration into a ramjet, and it can be put into scramjets and so on. So it's very versatile, and so that's the main advantage here. Now, of course, none of this comes without a price to pay, right? So why don't we have functioning detonation engines today that are as good as gas turbines? And the problem comes from the fact that if you think about detonation, they're always studied using premixed fuel air mixtures. So this is the typical system that's used for detonation research. RDEs, like the picture shown on the left, sort of go away from this ideal scenario. So in detonation engines, you can see that there are 2 cylinders, and between the cylinder, there's a detonation wave that propagates in the circumferential direction, and fuel and air are fed from the bottom, and they mix, and then the mixed mixture is what is being detonated. Now, because this mixing happens through an unsteady process, it's never complete. You do not get full fuel air mixing. There's always a distribution of reactants. So the equivalence ratio changes across the system. As a result, the detonation waves are never ideal, and they are actually far from ideal. And so their structure is very dependent on the mixing, like how well you mix things changes what kind of detonation you get. Not only that, you may not have one detonation wave, but multiple waves that are moving back and forth, sometimes together, sometimes in opposite directions, and so on. And they're very geometry dependent. So in this sense, it's almost like thermoacoustic instability. So you cannot study them in abstract and hope to reproduce a practical system. You really need to study the system itself because wave reflections, interaction between injectors, all of these things become critical. So it is a complex device. And detonations themselves are very thin. We're talking about like sub-millimeter kind of thickness. The reaction itself occurs through transverse waves and detonation into our wave interactions, which are could be of the order of microns, if not sub-micron in resolution. The device itself would be about 1 meter size. So there's a huge range of length scales. And more importantly, this system takes many, many seconds, perhaps, to reach steady state. So you have a huge range of length and time scales. So for computational purposes, this is a nightmare. This is probably the most complicated flow system one can study. So the way I want to talk about it is like, what are the non-ideal natures of detonation engines? What is it that we need to focus on? What computational tools we have developed to address these issues? And what do we know about liquid injection in the same systems? Because if you have practical gas turbines or propulsion systems, you do not want gas injection alone. It has to be liquid injection. So for the computational approach, there are many different ways to think about it. But if you look at the most detailed simulations, they all solve Navier-Stokes equations. They capture the shock, which is a requirement. You cannot fit the shock because shock is moving very fast. You need to have an adequate resolution of the shock and reaction structure. And the large-scale motions, you need to be able to capture it. In addition, you need to be able to capture the geometry also, which can be sometimes quite complicated. So the bottom right shows a rocket RDE from Air Force, which has a fuel injector on the inside and an oxidizer injector on the outside. That's only one pair. I think there are 72 of these pairs around the circumference. So this is a very complicated system overall. So if you solve this flow, if you run these codes, what you see here on the top, these are movies, and once I click somewhere, it's going to start running. But before that, the top half is a geometry from Air Force. The bottom half is a geometry from University of Michigan from my colleague, Mirko Gamba. And these are nominally operating at roughly similar mass flow rates, similar inflow conditions, hydrogen as fuel, air as oxidizer. But only the geometry is different. And so if you see how this works, oops, that's not right. You can see the waves moving around. So in the top picture, you have two shock waves, two detonation waves that are moving together in the same direction. In the bottom picture, you don't see it right now, but it'll come back from the other side. There's only one detonation wave. And what you can see on the right-hand side is a cut of one of the injectors. So there are hundreds of these, 120 injectors, I think, in this configuration. So this is one of them. And if you look at it, if you look at the cross-section, as the detonation wave progresses, goes over the injectors shut off because the pressure is too high inside and the pressure is not high enough for the fuel to inject or the air stream to inject. So as a result, as the wave goes through, the injectors are shut, and after some time, the pressure expands outside. The injectors are unfrozen, so they start releasing their charges, and at that point, mixing again starts. So it's this stoppage of flow blockage, that's the critical aspect. The flow blockage really depends on the strength of the wave, and the strength of the wave controls what pressure you will have in the system. And if the pressure is high, the blockage will be for a longer time. And if the pressure is low, the blockage will be for a shorter time. And so there's a coupling between this injector and what happens in the system itself, right? And there are other features also. For instance, this is another movie. If you take the detonation engine, unwrap it, what you will see are flow structures that look like this. So this is, the three frames here. The top is pressure, the middle is temperature, and the bottom is equivalence ratio as plotted by local composition. And what you will see is that the shock wave does not have uniform pressure. It changes as it goes by. The temperature contours have a peak right behind the shock, but there are also some burning happening in front of the shock itself. So this is called parasitic combustion that actually decreases efficiency of the engines. So there are a lot of different things happening, and it's pretty complicated in structure overall. But the point to note is that the equivalence ratio, just before the detonation wave comes through, you can see it by the passing wave on the bottom frame. You see that the equivalence ratio changes quite a bit, between 0 and 2. So very rich to almost no fuel. And this variation is one of the key aspects that we really need to understand, the stratification of the fuel-air mixture. So if you think about the physics of the problem, what really matters is the fact that as the wave is moving, in front of the wave, the fuel and air is mixing in a very hot gas that's from the previous cycle of the shock wave. And that causes some kind of pre-burning, and it releases some of the heat at lower pressure. So that's a decrease in efficiency. And then whatever is processed and leftover fuel and air is now processed by the detonation wave. So there's this coupling between this pre-burning and what you have for the detonation itself. All of this ties to what we call injector dynamics. So if the detonation wave has very different strengths, the way the injectors block and then release themselves will change. And so the level of blockage, the time for which they are blocked, all of this control how much stratification you will get. So for instance, if the wave blocks the flow for a predominant part of the cycle, the fuel and air have very little time to mix before the detonation wave comes through. And so you will have a very stratified mixture through which the shock wave has to progress. So there's some kind of adjustment. The shock wave and the detonation wave respond to the fuel injectors, and so they set up some kind of equilibrium. And there's a coupling between this detonation process and the injection process. So this will come to in a second, but it's important to understand that the injectors are very critical for what's happening within the system. And if you change the injectors, you can change what kind of waves you get and what kind of wave speed you get. So this is more details. It's not critical for now. So I'm going to skip this slide for this particular slide. What I want to get to is this coupling. And this is one of the lessons we learned from our study of hydrogen combustor, is that there is a coupling between small scales and large scales. And large scales here imply things that you can control based on the device. So these are injectors, injector sizes, the length of the plenum, the size, the diameter of the combustor itself, things like that. And those features set up how the injector recovers, how fast it will recover, how things are going to mix, and so on. So those are the parts that are in this green color on the bottom left. But once you set up this stratification, there's a detonation wave that passes through, and that detonation wave now will have a particular strength, and that strength really depends on the stratification and so on, right? And so you'll have certain number of waves, which we do not know how to estimate ahead of time, and they will have some wave speed that it goes through. And again, this wave speed and this number of waves dictates how fast the injector will recover. So there is this coupling between the injectors and the detonation process, which is the entire RDE. And the funny part is we know this coupling exists. We're now able to write it, but we cannot, we are not able to figure out yet, and no one has figured out yet, what's the link between them. So for instance, if I design an RDE today, I cannot predict ahead of time how many waves will be in the system and how fast those waves will go. So there's no way to know. All we can do is experimentally study it and notice how many waves we have. There's certain things we can figure out. Like for instance, if you keep increasing the mass flow rate that goes through the injectors, we know that more waves can be formed. So that's almost given. But we cannot predict a priori what we call the operating mode of the RDE, number of waves and the wave speed. So this still remains a very big challenge. So that's what this slide tells you. Like, we can predict certain things, maybe like pressure or things like that. But if you really look at the details, simulations very rarely predict experiments accurately. You cannot predict the wave speeds in the experiments. And if you do predict the wave speeds, what you'll find is the pressures that you predict are not correct. So there's something missing in the simulations that we have not yet figured out what it is. It's unclear. And different people will say different things. It could be chemistry, it could be the numerics that we use, it might be lack of resolution. So there are all these variables that are still there. But this is common. Like, some simulations do show good agreement with experiments, but then we do not know what is the reason for that agreement also, because the methods used are very similar and so on. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, if you really want to understand or make another step towards understanding these RDEs, the best thing that can be done computationally is to make sure that the detonation waves are fully resolved. You put as many grid points as possible to get all the structures within the detonation wave to work. And this, typically in the field of detonations, adaptive mesh refinement has been used for many, many decades now. So starting with Professor Elaine Oran in the 90s, the use of AMR has been very prominent. So this is something that's very common. What has happened more recently is that these tools have been scaled on supercomputers, so we can run much bigger problems now than what is feasible before. So for instance, at the bottom, I show you a plot where we have successively higher resolution. So in that eta is an induction length. You can think of this as the ignition delay time multiplied by the wave speed. So that's a length scale. And the denominator is the grid size that we have. And if you use a eta to delta x of 10, the wave is laminar. It looks laminar, which means it's planar. There are no instabilities. If you go to a resolution of 40, you start seeing instabilities. And if you go to 160, you see these jets that come out. And if you go to 320, they're much sharper, but the structure does not change all that much beyond that. So what this tells us is that you need to have grid resolutions that are comparable to about 200 grid points per induction length, which is a very difficult task for practical detonation engines. You need very high, large number of simulation capacity or capability to do something like that. So The other point I want to make, and I always talk about this, and I want everyone to understand what is going on in the supercomputing world, because sometimes this information is lost in all the messages that come out. Fitting these big calculations on a supercomputer is not a trivial task, and anyone who does supercomputing will easily understand this. Um, what has happened with supercomputers in the last 10 years or so is that we have become more and more reliant on certain kinds of specialized hardware that are typically designed for machine learning applications, not for the kind of computations we do. And as a result, what has happened is that we can do very large number of grid points, like billions of grid points, but only for a very short time, like microseconds or milliseconds. What we cannot do is very small number of grid points for hours of simulation. We cannot do that. So if you take an RDE and you want to see what is the temperature on the walls, to reach the thermal steady state, you'll have to simulate maybe like 20 minutes of RDE operation. That's virtually impossible today with any calculation. If you look at most simulations, they run for about 5 to 10 milliseconds if you're lucky. That's the longest duration that it's run. And part of this comes from this idea that the way the new supercomputers are, they are good at doing parallel computations. They're very efficient, but moving through time is a sequential process, and you cannot scale it very easily. So this is the fundamental limitation. Now, the reason we use AMR, or at least this is the selling pitch for AMR, is that you can fit the range of length scales and the range of time scales onto a computer with some loss of efficiency, but you're still able to fit all of it into it. So that's the selling point. Now, this is not without its own problems, and that's a whole different conversation altogether. But if you do this, you can try to simulate the entire range of scales. So this is what we did for studying the effect of stratification, which is what I showed here. So if I said before, the stratification plays a crucial role in how detonations evolve. So what we did was we took a simple geometry in which you have a stratified mixture, and then you send in a detonation wave, and you see what happens. So we do the simulations with a grid resolution about 145 points per induction length. If you did a uniform box with this, you will need about 1 trillion grid points, which is pretty large. You have to understand that 1 trillion grid points also means you need to solve species on top. So if you're talking about 30 to 40 trillion degrees of freedom, which is a huge calculation. But if you use AMR, you can bring it down to about 1 billion grid points, which is still large, but not as large as 1 trillion. Yeah. And then we can solve what happens here. So I'll show you a picture. I don't know which one of this I need to click to make it work, but I'll run this and all of them simultaneously. And on the top is pressure, bottom is temperature, and on the right-hand side, they're zoomed-in versions. And they're going through the stratified mixture, and you can see that the detonations are no longer very regular. There are pockets that are unburned. The wave moves in different directions, and they're in general less efficient at processing the fuel air mixture than if you had a uniform concentration across the domain. So this is the kind of result that we were looking for to really understand what is the role of stratification. So what it tells us is that if you have stratification, there are pockets that are unburned, and as a result, the heat release that would have come from burning those pockets is not available to push the wave. So the wave sort of slows down because of this inefficiency. There are more details here, but essentially, what the process tells you is that you have a very different kind of detonation wave compared to what you would have for a uniform mixture. So I have this movies on the right-hand side, which tells you how this detonation front looks like if your stratification length scale, so if you vary the fuel air mixture over small length scales as opposed to a larger length scale, how it looks. And you can see here that the corrugation and the change in location really depends on the stratification. So if you have large scale stratification, big blobs of fuel and air everywhere, the wavefront is very corrugated. It can look like a premix flame that's corrugated. But if you have smaller length scales, then it's almost straight. It doesn't have that many corrugations. So that is what we learned with gas phase RDEs. And one of the the main things are that there is a coupling between large and small scales. But the second important point is that there's inefficiency because you're not able to put in fuel and air uniform. And so there's some loss of efficiency that comes from this. Now, whether it's good or bad is open for debate. That's a different topic. And I'm happy to explain this later. But we do not know if we need to have uniform fuel air mixture. But we do know that it has to mix to some level. Otherwise, you cannot sustain the detonation. Now, practical devices cannot use gases. They have to use liquids. And so we started looking at liquid-fueled RDEs. Some of the pioneering work were done at University of Michigan like 60 years ago by Nichols, and then from a lot from Russia. And now a lot more work is being done in China. And Peter Wolansky, who until he passed away a couple of years ago, but until then he was the preeminent researcher in Poland for these kinds of systems. And more recently, there's this experiment from Karim Ahmed at UCF on a detonation where we just saw it pass through, hitting a droplet, and you see what happens to those droplet structures. So the real idea we want to understand is what happens if you have a liquid fueled RDE. What do we need to understand to make that function? So this is the main question we have. Now, there are many physical processes. This is as complex as you can imagine. If detonations are complicated, liquid fuel detonations are 10 times more complicated. So there is, first of all, the interaction between the shock or the detonation wave and the liquid jet. So it's going to atomize or do things like this. Then you have the fuel jet that is going to hit the oxidizer jet and atomize through shear layer. So that's a whole other process. All of this needs to evaporate and mix before combustion can happen. Oops. And once this evaporation happens, you still have stratified mixture. And so you will have combustion that looks vastly different than what you have in single phase detonation. So on the left, you have a sample image of what happens in a stratified case. So it's as complicated as it gets. So we've done some very preliminary studies. I know there are other works now looking at full-scale RDEs with liquids, but they're all very preliminary. We are just starting to look at this. So this is not a very mature area yet. So we took this liquid, this RDE design, rocket RDE design from Air Force, the one that I showed some time back. And what we did was to just inject liquid through it. So instead of gaseous methane, which is what it was designed for, we inject liquid RP2 through it. And then we change the diameter of the nozzles and things like that to change mass flow. So if you do this, you get this very interesting flow structure. So I'll run the left one, which is a movie that shows temperature. And on the top right, you see droplets moving in the field. And you can see a detonation wave that's moving left, that's hitting the droplets. And if you run this, you get a mean wave speed of about 1400 meters per second. If you look at detonation theory and CJ speed, that speed should be about 2300 or 2400 meters per second. So this is really slow waves that are propagating compared to theoretical limits. And oh, I thought this would work, but it's not. So what you see on the left-hand side is what should be a movie, but now it's an instantaneous picture of heat release rate and the detonation waves moving. So there are about 3 waves in this, if you look at it. And of those 3 waves, you can see that the waves are not straight or they're not simple. They're quite corrugated. They're spatially extended. And this feature comes from the fact that evaporation is not very rapid in these systems. So there's a time delay for fuel release, which controls all of this. So the interesting part we found is that it comes from the bottom right table here. All of these images say the same thing, but in different ways. For the sake of time, I'm going to make it simpler. When you run any RDE configuration, you can figure out what fraction of the heat release happens due to detonation and what fraction happens due to deflagration. Ideally, if you want to get everything to work very well, you want all heat release from detonation, 100%, which is very difficult to get. If you get like 80, 90%, that's really good design. Even 60, 70 is pretty good. What we find here is that for liquid fuel RDEs, the detonation fraction is about 50% for one configuration. And even if you make a slight change to the nozzle, it drops to like 20%. Okay, so there's a huge sensitivity to geometry, which is not seen in gas phase RDEs. And so we really want to understand what is going on here. Why is there such a big difference in efficiency? So that requires us to understand how detonations interact with droplets, which is something that people have not really looked at carefully. So we have an operating theory for what is going on here. So in liquid fuel RDEs, there are two different kinds of detonations that can happen. The first one, which I call decoupled detonation, is where you inject fuel air, they atomize through shear, the jets interact, they atomize. And when the shock hits it, it becomes smaller droplets, but the droplets are still quite large, so they cannot immediately evaporate. So the detonation just goes by, it doesn't do much. Then the droplets sit and evaporate. So they have this time for the wave to come back during which they evaporate. And when the detonation wave comes through, all it's doing is burning this evaporated mass. So in this sense, it takes 2 cycles to really evaporate or burn the fuel that you're injecting. So this is the decoupled detonation where detonation propagates over just a heterogeneous gas phase mixture. What we really want to get at is a problem where the detonation wave hits the droplets, completely atomizes it, evaporates it, and burns and releases the heat before the sonic plane that cuts off heat release impact on detonation happens. So this is a coupled two-phase detonation. And if you think about it, there's so many things happening, and this length would be roughly 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters. That's the total length that you have to really execute all of these physics, which seems pretty difficult. But it turns out that there are experiments that seem to suggest this. And this is the whole interest in liquid fuel RDEs in this country right now. So I call it the coupled two-phase detonation, and we wonder if this more is even feasible. And there are many experiments now that have come online. So when I made these slides, this experiment from Kareem was the only one that showed this. Since then, Jason Burr at AFRL has shown similar results, and now Kareem has shown other results that sort of seem to confirm this coupled detonation mode. And essentially what he did was this: he took this long detonation tube, he had a single pair of injectors that inject liquid RP2 and oxygen into the system, and then he filled the whole tube with hydrogen and oxygen, which seems very dangerous, but that's what he did. And then he sent in a detonation wave. So the detonation would propagate in gas phase, come close to this injector, hit the droplets, and then it will pass by. And what he measured on the top is the detonation velocity. And when you measure the detonation velocity, what you observe is that the detonation velocity is initially like 1800 meters per second or something. So the x-axis here is time. You can think of this as distance traveled also. When the wave velocity hits a minimum, that's when it encounters the droplets. It's sort of quenched. But then after it passes the droplets, it jumps back up to very high values. It goes to like 2100 meters per second. And then as time progresses, it slowly goes down and reaches the initial value, which is about 1800 or so. So that jump from very low value to 2100, he inferred this to be based on the RP2 droplets undergoing this coupled detonation mode. So this was his inference. And at that time, this was the only data. So there were a lot of other competing ideas for why this was happening. But now we know that his inference was correct. This is what is happening. If you do the same with simulation, so this is the top is a simulation of the exact same system, you will not reproduce this information. In the simulations, the velocity will drop, like what I show here in the top bottom left plot. But when the velocity goes back up, it only reaches the same velocity as what it had before. It will not go above that value. And if you look into the details, what you will find is that the droplet evaporation happens much later compared to where the shock front is located. So they are not coupled. So the simulations are not able to model the coupled interaction. It can only model the decoupled interaction. So this is a fundamental limitation of the computational models that we have. So if we have to make progress, we have to understand how droplets interact with detonations. So this is what we started looking at. And there are many other studies we have done since then, but I just want to show you what we're doing here. So this is a two-phase simulation where the droplet is fully resolved using a diffuse interface approximation. We take into account many factors to make sure that the values we get for things like temperature and pressure are physical, which is not always the case with these kinds of simulations. So if I now run this, here you have a 3D droplet hit by a shock wave, and you can see that shock wave flattening and then rupturing, right? And then it becomes these millions of small droplets. And what we know now is that these small droplets are actually not droplets, but they have already been released in vapor form because of high temperature. So everything that you see in the cloud behind is actually in gas phase already. So it only needs to mix and will start burning very quickly. So this is a very interesting and exciting development. And what we know now is also that if you change the Mach numbers and if you change the diameters, there's certain patterns that emerge on how these things collapse. And much of this is only driven by inertia. It's not driven by surface tension or other properties. It's only inertia that causes this rupture, the inertia of the shock hitting the droplet. So I'll show you some examples here of what's going on to drive a more important point here, which is that if you look at what's happening, the droplets break down and form a droplet cloud behind, which is spread out. So they're not all right behind the droplet. It actually spreads quite a bit. And you have this pressure and velocity that are also changing, which is very high in front of the droplet, but drops quite low behind the droplet. So this is that Mach 3. But if I go through what happens for different Mach numbers and diameters, there is a scaling that was originally proposed by Nichols based on inertial theory. And that scaling seems to work remarkably well in describing what goes on. So here, for instance, there is a time scale that you can define based on droplet diameter d0, the shock induced velocity u, and then the ratio of the densities between gas and liquid phase. So that gives you a time scale. And regardless of your Mach number and droplet diameter, the complete disintegration happens in 3 to 5 of these time scales, which it turns out is a very short time. And so this sort of tells us that there is a possibility to get coupled detonation if the initial shock is able to rupture the droplet very quickly. And we have done some studies to show that if the shock is what is causing the rupture, that breakup time can be as short as 5 microseconds. And remember that these waves are moving at about 2,000 meters per second, 2 kilometers per second. So if you look at distance, that would be about 10 millimeters. So you can have all of the droplet breakup and evaporation to happen within 10 millimeters. And so ignition can happen within a millimeter or so after that. So you can have a whole detonation complex that are only like 11 to 15 millimeters thick, which is very, very thin. And here we have not accounted for other features, like you could have cavitation or you could have supercritical mixtures, and these are not accounted for this in this calculation. And molecular dynamics simulations from Professor Wang at Stanford has shown that those accelerate this process even more. So I think there is a way for the detonation to be coupled to the droplet evaporation. And this is really exciting. We think that this has a potential to change how we design all kinds of propulsion systems. So this is my summary and conclusions. From all the things we have done over the last 8 years, many students involved. So it's not, the conclusions I'm saying here, I've learned from my students. It's not something I figured out on my own. Is that the large and small scale coupling between the injectors and the chamber matters a lot for RDS. This is what controls what's going on within the system. And if you go to liquid fuel systems, there's a lot more physics to resolve, but we are now beginning to understand what controls that kind of RDE. And so that's a very exciting topic. Computational tools are maturing. It's better than when we started. So when we started, there was one other code that could simulate RDEs. Now there are many groups that can do this routinely. So more people involved, there's more room for innovation. So I'm very, I'm very excited that there can be more tools very soon. And we are working on AMR. I know other groups are also working on similar capabilities, but this we feel is a path forward. May not be the only path, but we feel is a path. But there are a lot of things that are missing, especially from experimental side. Chemical kinetics is always a challenge. We still do not know what happens for these kinds of problems. We don't know the details of the flow structure. It's all inferred from pressure data and chemiluminescence images. Laser diagnostics that are very detailed. And even if laser diagnostics are done, it's not quantitative. They tend to be qualitative. So that's an issue. And for liquid systems, there's really no data at all. It's just visual images most of the time. So there's a lot of work to be done. So it's very exciting time to be in this field. And I hope I showed something of what we are doing. This is all I had. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer it. Thank you.